Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about the double pawns. And I'd like to show you, first of all, a very famous game played between two chess geniuses, two former world champions, Vasily Smyslov and Mikhail Tal. In this particular game, their contrasting styles favored Smyslov. He managed to reach this endgame with the opportunity to create double pawns for Tal. In the position we see, white captured black's knight on c6. Obviously, black has no choice but to recapture, and now we reach this knight versus bishop endgame with the four rooks still on the board and most of the pawns, where black has serious difficulties despite the pawns being present on both sides of the board. Let's see the wonderful technique of one of the best endgame players of all times, Vasily Smyslov. The first thing he did was he recognized that his knight on h4 did its job there. I guess it went there to open the diagonal of white's light squared bishop earlier so it can take on c6. And now it's time to bring that knight back to where the action is, the middle of the board and the queen side. The knight aims to go to e5 and to attack the c6 pawn from there, or at other times maybe go to d3 via e5 and attack the pawn on c5. That explains black's next move, which was f6, preventing the white knight to centralize on e5. However, the knight can go in other routes as well, and it did, went to d2 right away. Right away aiming to go to e4, another central square this time. Tal played rook f to d8, occupying the only open file, allowing the white knight to come to e4 in hopes that now he'll play c4. Of course, if black would simply manage to exchange that doubled c pawn for white's healthy b pawn, that would be an accomplishment. But white is not about to let that simply happen. He played knight to c5, an intermediate move, attacking black's bishop and, by the way, protecting the pawn on b3. The bishop moved away, and here white would have the option to capture the c4 pawn, winning a pawn but doubling his own pawns on the c file. Oftentimes, when we can capture a pawn and it's a free extra pawn, it's a good thing, even though it's a double pawn, because it's an extra pawn. However, there are a good number of cases, just like this one, when it's better not to gain that extra pawn if the cost is to create a pair of double pawns. Smyslov continued by playing f3. It's important to understand that black cannot simply get rid of his weakness by capturing and trading pawns on b3, because then white would first trade rooks on d8, followed by recapturing with the pawn, connecting those two isolated pawns, the a and c pawns, and at the same go right away opening the rook's power along the a file. Now the only way to protect that a7 pawn is by moving the rook to the corner to a8, and then white again is ready to attack a second pawn on c6, and now black cannot hold on to both a7 and c6 pawns at the same time. Therefore, black is losing a pawn. Let's get back to the actual game. And in this position, Tal replied by playing bishop to c2, inviting White to leave that open file with his rook. And Smyslov traded the rooks. And as so often is in endgames, it's time to bring the king to the game. King f2. After this king move, it's clear that moving in with the rook to the second rank would only be a temporary accomplishment, because White could easily chase the rook out with the king from either e3 or even e1. Therefore, in this position, Black didn't even try doing that, but brought his king also towards where the action is, the middle of the board. And here, another situation when Smyslov had the option indeed to capture that pawn, but he rather chose to push through in hopes that he will eventually win that pawn without doubling his own pawns. Let's see how the game developed. For the moment being, Black needs to be a bit careful about his own bishop on c2, making sure it will not be trapped and it will have a retreat. And therefore he moved the bishop back to f5. And now came king e1, making sure the black rook is not getting into d2 and stay on the second rank. And here Black made an inaccuracy by playing e5. It was a bit better to prevent White's next move and retreat the bishop to c8. True, that's quite a passive move and doesn't look very appealing, but it was still better than what we're about to see. White continued with a knight regrouping by moving knight to b7 with a tempo attacking Black's rook, and after rook to d7, knight a5, a dual attack attacking two of Black's pawns. But Black hoped that he'll play c5 and again force White to double up his pawns, which he accomplished. But now the problem is White is already up a pawn and the second pawn is still in danger. Black continued by counterattacking, playing rook to d5, and White went back to b7, protecting the pawn. As so often, tactics are a very important part of the game. For example, here e4 was an option, but Black would have escaped by capturing the pawn on c5 and counterattacking the knight on a5. And if now knight b7, then rook c7 keeps attacking the knight, and if in this position White gives a check, the king will move out of the check again by attacking the knight. So White did not have an option to win right away with the fork by e4. Smyslov continued by defending the pawn from b7, and now again important that the bishop is unable to retreat to c8 because of a fork with knight to d6. And Black, on the other hand, needs to move out of that forking threat of e4 and move to the rook back to d7. And now came knight to d6 check. White's position really is a decisive advantage at this point, but let's see quickly how Smyslov ended the game. King e7 and g4. White is in no rush in grabbing that pawn on c4, although it was definitely also a very playable option here. Bishop went back to e6, and white occupied the open b file. Black is going after the pawn, and white is forcing the trade of rooks. King d7, and now white is looking after new targets, new weaknesses in black's position, and played knight d6. Now if black would play king to c6, then white could continue by playing knight e8, attacking the pawn on f6, and once that pawn moves up, then after g5, white could go knight f6, going after the pawn on h7. Let's go back again to the game position, and in this position, black continued by playing h6. And again, time to improve the position of the king. Luckily, the pawn on c5 is not in any danger, as after king takes pawn on c5, knight e4 would fork and win back the pawn on f6. Few more moves in the game. Black continued by a5, when white went after the pawn on f6, f5, knight g7 attacking the bishop, bishop d7, pawn takes, and f4. As we can see, white is transforming one type of an advantage to another. Now, if finally black would win back that c5 pawn, white would get a new passed pawn by capturing the e5 pawn. Came king to d5, and now a cute move, c6. If bishop takes pawn on c6, then white would capture the pawn on f5, and if the king would capture the pawn on c6, then white would capture the pawn on e5. Black was trying to hang on to both for the time being, move the bishop to c8, hanging on to the f5 pawn, but now the c pawn runs away. Came king d6, and after h4, black resigned. A very instructive game by Smyslov. The important part was to make the decision to give up the bishop for a knight, to make double pawns, isolated double pawns for black. Now I'd like to share with you one of my own games that I played in my very first chess Olympiad back in 1988. My opponent was the then already American Aksharumova Gulko, and my opponent just played knight f4, attacking my bishop on e6 as well as my pawn on g6. At first it seems that despite having double pawns on the e file, white's position is quite attractive. For example, if I would move my bishop to f7 to protect both the bishop and the pawn, white would follow up with e6, and indeed, my position wouldn't be enviable. If I would protect my bishop with my queen, then I would just lose my pawn on g6. And, of course, most importantly, I wasn't able to just capture the pawn on e5, because the knight captures the pawn on g6, creating a double attack on the queen and the rook. So what should I do? Well, I thought and decided on a move that usually, of course, is not very recommendable. In the middle of the game, walking out with my king. But this is an exception to that rule, because there are still all the pawns on the board, and therefore I have excellent chances to hide behind them, even if temporarily my king ends up being right on e6, kind of in the middle of the board. Now white suffers with his double pawns, the one on e5, is right away in danger. Although white can protect the pawn on e5 in the meantime. And now it's interesting how the dynamic of the game takes over. And black here has an excellent way to push the issue and gain a significant advantage. If that wouldn't be available, strategically speaking, white would be quite fine, because they may just capture my knight on e4, or look for some other way to take advantage of my king's very delicate position on e6. But here I foresaw a series of ambitious moves that forces white into passivity and eventually to lose a pawn. I continued here by playing queen to b6, attacking the pawn on e3. Now, unluckily for white, they cannot protect that pawn from e2, neither with the queen or the king, because of an upcoming fork with the knight on g3. Therefore, the only reasonable move here for white is to protect the pawn from c1. Now I continued with knight g3. Well, this move forces white to give up on the right to castle on the king side. The rook needs to move to one of the two awkward squares. The rook moved to g1, and here the rook is on an unprotected square, which happens to be important in this case because I had another ambitious aggressive moves at my disposal, and played g5, threatening to use this very pin along the a7 g1 diagonal. I am threatening to capture the pawn on f4, as white is not able to recapture because the rook would be hanging on g1. If in this position white would trade pawns on g5, then it's quite clear that the pawn on e5 will be lost. Probably I will not want to capture it with my king, but I would simply go back with my queen to c7 and then capture it with my queen. After f5, my opponent played king to f2, attacking my knight, but by capturing the pawn on f4, I also protect my knight. In the meantime, white is in a pin, cannot recapture, therefore played king to f3, in hopes that now I cannot capture on e3 because then the knight on g3 would be lost, but I planned to play knight e4. Now, another tactic, pawn cannot capture because of immediate checkmate. And after king captures, now of course the white king is competing with black's in being in a sensitive position. And again I continued by playing queen to c7 and winning that pawn on e5. And in several more moves I won the game. I'd like to share with you one more of my games that I played at the famous New York Open in 1989. In this game my opponent was Carlson, and I had the white pieces and it was my turn. My opponent has just attacked my queen on d3 and assumed that I'll have to move my queen. But this is one of those situations when I had an intermediate moves in addition to moving my queen. And in this case, it's a good one. I captured my opponent's knight on f6. Now it's not hard to get convinced that if rook takes queen and then bishop takes queen, then white comes ahead in material. Also, capturing back with the queen on f6 wouldn't be a great idea because white could play queen b5, attacking both bishops at the same time, when the only way black can save both the bishops is by moving back to b6, but then the pawn on b4 would be lost. Because of all of these tactical situations, Black had no choice but capturing back with the g-pawn and creating double pawns. Now, in such situations, having double pawns is a double trouble, namely because it's a weakness for the endgame. It's a disadvantage that the pawn in the back, the f7 pawn, is less valuable than the other pawns. But as long as there are queens on the board, it can create additional trouble that the safety of the black king is no longer quite there. And this is how I continued. Queen to c4, moving away from the attack with a tempo, attacking black's bishop immediately, and of course eyeing towards the king's side, going to g4. My opponent protected the bishop, and I continued by playing queen g4 check. Came king h8, and I simply improved the position of my rook. Here, if I were black, I probably would rather try going rook g8 right away, on one hand trying to defend the king's side, and at the same go maybe having some hopes to create a counterattack along the g file in collaboration with black's nice bishop on b7. I was certainly glad when I saw my opponent playing rook to d5, and here I traded rooks, and when the bishop recaptured, I continued by playing queen h4. This move for now ties down, pins down black's pawn on f6, because if the f-pawn would move ahead after a trade of queens, black's rook on c8 would be undefended. And now my opponent moved out of the pin and came to that g file. And I decided to move my king out of that pin to liberate my bishop from e2. Again, it's not advisable for black to play f5, because after the exchange of queens, my rook would get into the 7th rank. My opponent continued by playing a5, and now my bishop was free to go to d3, threatening with checkmate, and after rook g7 came bishop to e4. A very important trade, because now after the trade of the bishops, it's clearly, in addition to the previous problems that black already had, white now has a good knight versus bad bishop type of position. The reason being that these two black pawns are blocked on the same color as their bishops. On the other hand, the white knight will have an excellent outpost on c4 from where it cannot be chased out, and at the same time will target black's a5 pawn. My opponent played queen a7, and now I managed to activate all my pieces real quick, and knight d2, running to that important c4 square. And black is trying to get the rook back to protect the bishop, but now black's problem, in addition to the ones already discussed, is that the king is being left all alone on the king's side, and I'm able to relocate my pieces from the queen's side to the king's side much quicker than black is to mobilize his pieces for defense to his king. And check, and all of a sudden my queen is back, my rook is clearly participating in the attack, while the black queen and rook are too late in coming to the king's defense. And in this position, my opponent resigned. And let's move on to the next position, which is a game of my sister Sophia's. She played this position against Grandmaster Flair in 1987. And here, despite her knight is being attacked on g5, she found a way to create double and in fact triple pawns for her opponent. She played knight g6 and now queen h3, threatening with all kind of unpleasant things for black with a queen check on h7 as well as on e6. If rook takes rook, then the rook on c8 is hanging. So black pretty much had no choice but capturing the knight on g5, and as we can see, now black is stuck with triple pawns on the g file. And another little cute tactic, rook captured on d5, giving white significant strategical advantage for the endgame. Of course, if rook takes d5, then after queen c8, white has a winning game. The game continued with queen e2 when Sophia traded rooks and then simply protected the rook with queen d3 and had a clearly better endgame and later won. And finally, I'd like to share with you another gorgeous, beautiful endgame, a jewel of the week. In this position, white has a number of double, in fact a triple pawn on the b file, but it seems that two of those pawns are quite a bit in danger. If white would now continue with the obvious looking move b7, then black would respond with a check and then catching that b pawn. And as the king comes closer, black would attack the pawn and now would escape after rook takes pawn. Look at that. Therefore, we need to go back and think again, what is the correct solution? Try to take your time, pause, and then come back, listen to the solution. The correct move here is playing rook e5, a pretty move, sacrificing the rook, deflecting the rook from the passed pawns, d7. Now if the rook goes behind the pawn on d5, then the other pawn, the b pawn, would also advance and black could not stop that pawn. Therefore, black continued with rook e6 with a tricky idea. Now the king cannot go to the 7th rank because of the fork with rook e7. So the king goes to g5 and now rook b6. But what's the trick here? Well, the trick is that if white promotes the pawn to a queen, it's stalemate again. Wow, quite amazing. So what should white do in this position? The solution is under promotion, promoting the pawn to a knight. And amazingly, black is in zugzwang. White has no threat, but because black needs to make a move, the rook needs to move into one of the several forks. Quite an amazing endgame. In just 5 moves, 7 ideas. The pin, stalemate, under promotion, zugzwang, the domination of the knight, and the fork. Well, I hope you enjoyed this beautiful last position, as well as gained some ideas on how to deal with doubled pawns. Well, hopefully on your end you'll try to avoid having them. But if your opponent allows you to make a trade that would create double pawn for them, usually it's a good idea to take advantage of it. Thank you for listening, and until next week.